My name is Aria Bennett, and I didn't cry when my husband said the baby wasn't his. I cried when he said it, in front of his board of directors. The room was silent for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Between accusation and humiliation. We were hosting the quarterly shareholder dinner at the Monarch Hotel in Chicago. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, investors worth more than small countries. My husband, Nathan Bennett, standing at the head of the table like he owned oxygen itself. He always loved an audience. I was 7 months pregnant, and glowing, according to the women who leaned in to whisper how lucky I was. Lucky. Nathan raised his glass to make a toast. To growth, he began smoothly. To expansion, and to transparency. That word, transparency. He looked at me then, not warmly, strategically. Double quotes, and sometimes, he continued, smiling thinly, transparency means addressing rumors. I felt something shift in my chest, subtle, cold. There have been questions, he said calmly, about timing, about loyalty. Murmurs began. He turned fully toward me. So let's be clear, he said evenly. This child is not mine. The air left the room, not loudly, quietly, like a vacuum seal snapping shut. I did not stand up. I did not scream. I placed my hand on my stomach, and I looked at him. Are you sure? I asked softly. He smiled, a rehearsed, polished smile. Biology is precise, he replied, but arrogance is not. Nathan Bennett built Bennett Global Holdings from inherited steel money into a logistics empire. He prided himself on legacy, bloodline continuity. His father died young. His grandfather built everything. Nathan worshipped the idea of lineage. He spoke about it often. My son will inherit stability, he would say confidently. He never imagined the word son could destabilize him. The rumors began 2 weeks earlier. An anonymous message sent to 3 Minor board members, suggesting the pregnancy timeline overlapped with a charity gala I attended alone. Nathan confronted me privately. He didn't yell, he calculated. Convince me, he said coldly. I was stunned. Convince you, I repeated. Yes, he said, because perception matters. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. He didn't care about truth. He cared about optics. I offered a DNA test immediately. He refused. Publicly, he said. At the right time, he wanted spectacle. He wanted control of narrative. He wanted me small. Back at the shareholder dinner, after his accusation, the board members shifted uncomfortably. Investors exchanged glances. My father, seated near the back, stood halfway before my mother touched his arm. I inhaled slowly. I'm glad you brought it up, I said clearly. The room quieted again, because I've already arranged the test. Nathan's smile faltered slightly. You acted without consulting me, he asked. I acted without doubting myself, I replied. The test results were due the next morning. He thought he was cornering me. He didn't know. I had ordered something else, a broader genetic profile. For the baby, for him, for the family line, quietly, privately. Because when a man obsessed with bloodline accuses you publicly, you don't just defend the child, you examine the blood. That night, we returned home in silence. The Bennett estate sat on 20 manicured acres in Lake Forest. Security gates, stone pillars, legacy carved into architecture. Nathan walked ahead of me. I gave you a chance to handle this privately, he said without turning around. You chose the stage, I replied calmly. He stopped. You think this won't matter? Oh, I said softly. It will. He misread my tone. He thought it meant fear. It meant certainty. The next morning, the DNA envelope arrived, sealed, stamped, irrefutable. Nathan insisted we open it in front of 2 board witnesses. Control, again. Performance, again. The envelope felt heavier than paper. Not because of the child, because of the empire. Attached to it, Nathan tore it open, scanned the page. His face changed. Not anger, not relief, confusion. Double quotes, what does it say? One board member asked quietly. He swallowed. It says, he began slowly, that the probability of paternity is 99.98%. The room exhaled collectively. I did not, because I was waiting. For clarity, I added calmly, please, read the second section. Nathan's eyes moved down the page, then back up, then down again. His hands began to shake. What second section? One of the directors asked. I stepped forward. Full genetic heritage comparison, I said clearly. Silence stretched. Nathan looked at me like I had betrayed something sacred. You had no right, he whispered. Oh, I said softly. I had every right. He tried to fold the page, too late. One of the directors reached for it. Reed then looked at Nathan differently. Not a CEO, as a man unraveling. According to this analysis, the director said carefully, there is a significant discrepancy between Mr. Bennett's genetic markers and the established Bennett lineage database. The words floated. Cold, precise, clinical. Nathan shook his head. That's impossible. Is it? Because legacy is fragile when built on assumption, and bloodline is not always what you inherit. Asterisk, the room was too quiet. Nathan's breathing grew. Uneven runneth again, he said sharply. One of the directors held the paper steady. It was run twice. He replied calmly. The report was clear. While Nathan was the biological father of my child, he was not genetically linked to the Bennett bloodline registered in the family trust. The same trust that controlled 70% of Bennett Global Holdings. The same trust that dictated succession. The same trust he built his entire identity. Aran, that database is wrong, Nathan snapped. It's not a database, I said quietly. It's your grandfather's genetic archive. His head turned toward me slowly. What did you do? He whispered. I asked questions, I replied. 3 weeks earlier, when he first accused me privately. Something in his tone felt rehearsed, not emotional, strategic. It made me review more than my own timeline. It made me review the Bennett trust documentation, and that's when I noticed something strange. The trust required verified genetic continuity every generation. Nathan had never completed the formal confirmation after his father's death. It was listed as deferred. Deferred. For 20 years. So when I ordered the paternity test, I added a full hereditary profile comparison. The lab pulled archived samples held by the trust's legal office. The results were now printed in Nathan's shaking hands. You don't understand what you've done, he muttered. Double quote. Oh, I do, I said softly. You questioned my loyalty publicly. I questioned your certainty privately. One of the senior board members stood. If this is accurate, he said slowly, the controlling trust clause activates. Nathan's head snapped toward him. No. Yes, the director replied evenly. If there is no direct biological continuity, majority trust shares enter provisional freeze until succession review, which meant Nathan's voting power was suspended. Immediately his face lost color. You would destroy the company over a lab result, he demanded. The director didn't flinch. We protect structure, not ego. Nathan looked at me then, not with anger, with something closer to fear. You knew, he said. I suspected, I replied. And I verified. He stepped toward me. You think this makes you powerful? No, I said calmly. It makes the truth visible. The board moved quickly. Emergency session. Trust lawyers called. Verification protocols activated within 48 hours. The Bennett succession line was under formal review, which meant Nathan could no longer sign contracts unilaterally, could no longer authorize asset transfers, could no longer claim absolute legacy authority for a man who built his identity on inherited blood. It was annihilation. Home that night. He paced the library like a trapped animal. You humiliated me, he hissed. You humiliated yourself. I corrected you. Forced this. No, I said evenly. You forced spectacle. I forced documentation. He stopped pacing. Do you even care what this does to the Bennett name? I held his gaze steadily. You cared more about the Bennett name than your own child. Silence, heavy, unavoidable. 3 days later, the truth emerged. Nathan's grandfather had quietly discovered, decades earlier, that his own son Nathan's father was not biologically his. The affair had been buried, the family preserved. Reputation over reality, legacy over genetics. The trust was built to prevent that happening again. Irony is patient, it waits. The board convened. Publicly, Prescott, wind of succession reviewer. Nathan refused to step down voluntarily. He insisted the science was flawed. But investors, do not gamble on uncertainty. Stock dipped, confidence wavered, and then the trust lawyers made it official. Until lineage, clarification was resolved. Executive authority would transfer to interim leadership. They turned to me, because I held independent shares through marital equity and strategic holdings. Nathan, once encouraged for tax benefits, he built the structure he just didn't imagine. Standing outside of it, double quotes Mrs. Bennett, the chairman said carefully, are you prepared to serve temporarily? Nathan stared at me, waiting for refusal, for sympathy, for surrender. I stood slowly. I am prepared, I said calmly, to protect stability. The headlines wrote themselves. Bennett Empire faces bloodline review. CEO authority suspended amid genetic discrepancy. Nathan's phone stopped ringing. Mine did not. At 7 months pregnant, I walked into the executive floor of Bennett Global. Employees watched carefully, not gossiping, assessing. Power is not volume, it is composure. I did not celebrate, I did not grandstand. I stabilized contracts, reassured investors, removed risk exposure, and I did it without ever raising my voice. Nathan tried one final move. He offered a private settlement. Withdraw the genetic disclosure, he said quietly in my office. I'll restore everything. I leaned back in my chair. You can't restore certainty, I replied. You shattered it yourself. He looked at my stomach. At least the child is mine, he said bitterly. I met his eyes. Yes, I said softly, and that is the only legacy that matters. Months later, after the birth of our son, the trust review concluded. Legally, Nathan retained family status, but the board amended succession policies permanently. Legacy would no longer depend solely on blood. It would depend on governance, competence, integrity. The Bennett Empire survived, but Nathan never fully recovered his authority. Because once doubt enters legacy, it never leaves completely. One evening, as I held my son on the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, Nathan stood beside me quietly. I never doubted the baby, he said finally. I doubted control. I know, I replied. He looked at our child, then at the horizon. You destroyed my certainty. I adjusted the blanket around our son gently. No, I said calmly. You built it on assumption. People still ask what I felt the moment the DNA results were read. Anger, triumph, revenge, none. Of those, what I felt was balance. He questioned my loyalty in front of power. The results questioned his power in front of loyalty. He said the baby wasn't his. The DNA said the empire wasn't entirely his either. And when legacy trembled, I didn't scream, I stepped forward. He challenged my child. The DNA challenged his dynasty. And only one of us walked away certain.